Welcome everyone to this NewsBud Roundtable. Joining us today is senior analyst and host of the Russian newspaper Monitor, Professor Philip Kovacevic. And of course, NewsBud's founder and editor, Sibel Edmonds. Now, you have both recently just returned from extended overseas trips, and I wanted to get your take on not only the information that you collected on your travels, but also your take on recent geopolitical developments that we are witnessing, specifically in the regions in which you were both just in, and how this all ties into the U.S. government's never-ending thirst for war. Now, I'd like to start with you first, Professor Kovacevic. You just returned from the Balkans. You spent some time in Montenegro. And it's interesting, Montenegro is recently in the news as President Trump was blasting Montenegro, saying that the tiny Balkan nation could be responsible for the start of World War III because of how aggressive Montenegrins are.
So membership in NATO obligates the members to defend any other member that's attacked. So let's say Montenegro, which joined last year, is attacked. Right. Why should my son go to Montenegro to defend it from attack? Why is that?
I understand what you're saying. I've asked the same question. You know, Montenegro is a tiny country with very strong people.
Yeah, I'm not against Montenegro or Albania.
No, by the way, they're very strong people. They're very aggressive people. They may get aggressive, and congratulations, you're in World War III. Now, I understand that, but that's the way it was set up.
Well, Professor Kovacevic, you are from Montenegro. I've known you for some time now, and I'm not sure that you have an aggressive bone in your body. So what is your take on the president's remarks?
Well, I should say that my slogan is make love, not war. But I also understand why people make war. And as far as this comment goes, well, you know, I believe that millions of people heard about Montenegro for the first time thanks to Donald Trump. So that's good news. The bad news, of course, is the context. Donald Trump is right about the leadership of Montenegro. The leadership of Montenegro, including the current president, Milo Djukanovic, is a group of cheaters, liars, and frauds. And they would do anything they could to stay in power. They would manufacture different events in order to prove to the West that they are on the Western side. So in other words, if some faction of the deep state in the United States or elsewhere in NATO wants to create a false flag event that could lead to some kind of a problem in the Balkans, they could depend on Djukanovic and his team to do that and to lie and cheat. And in fact, in my opinion, and I'm not the only one, Djukanovic is a war criminal. So he's got his hands in blood from the early 90s. And so he essentially would do anything that he's ordered to do by his handlers in the West. Now, Donald Trump has his reasons for saying something like this, and he knows, I think, much more than we do because he's got a lot of secret classified information coming to his desk. But I think he made a mistake here. I think he should have focused on Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, the former Soviet republics that are bordering Russia, because it is they that have the historical traumas against Russians, even though in some cases, you know, the Russians help them out. For instance, if we look at Lithuania, their capital, Vilnius, was under the Polish control before World War II. And then it was taken over by the Red Army during the war and was given to Lithuania, right? Not to Poland anymore. And yet today, if you go to Lithuania and listen to the current Lithuanian leadership, you'll see how anti-Russian they are. So what we are seeing in the Baltics and also in some places in the Balkans is the rewriting of history and even recent history. You know, it is the NATO propagandists that want countries like Lithuania and also Montenegro and others to forget about their recent history. So I don't believe that Montenegro will start World War III, but I think that Donald Trump is right in saying that the excessive expansion of NATO might bring into NATO certain countries that that have a different agenda, an agenda different from what is in the U.S. national interest and in the interest of the planet, which is not to fight a nuclear war against Russia. So I would say, and I would also add to this that we should not forget that Melania Trump, the first lady, is originally she was born in Slovenia at the time when Slovenia and Montenegro were within the same state of Yugoslavia. So who knows, maybe she had some negative personal experiences with some Montenegrins and passed on this information to her husband. Who knows? But I do think that Trump meant to say that expanding NATO is not a good idea from the standpoint of the U.S. national interests.
Well, recently there has been some meetings and summits. Trump just had a major summit with NATO where he was pressuring other NATO members to, of course, increase their spending on defense, which means buying more U.S. weapons, and he was very critical of NATO, certain members of NATO, which he has been in the past. Of course, we've seen this throughout his campaign where he talked about withdrawing from NATO altogether. He's kind of changed his tune, that maybe that was a leverage card throughout his campaign. But at the same time, we also see Trump having a summit with Vladimir Putin, the Russian president. And there's a lot of criticism you see in the media. Of course, they're attacking Trump. Trump attacks the media, goes back and forth. But we've been looking forward to getting your take specifically on this summit with Trump and Putin, as they seem to be working together on some fronts. And then at the same time, there's conflict between Trump and some of these NATO countries.
Well, there are so many things to talk about here. First of all, Trump wants to lead the United States the way he led his company. In other words, he wants to make business sense. If you look at the figures, the annual budget of NATO in total is about $950 billion. The U.S. is spending $700 billion out of those $950 billion, which is about more than 70%. And yet, the U.S. is protecting these countries that are not spending as much as the U.S. would fairly expect them to spend to be protected for their enemies, real or imagined. So Trump is saying essentially, you need to pay more. You need to pay more. We need to spread this burden more fairly. That's on one level. On the other level, of course, he wants to get contracts for the U.S. military-industrial complex, because these are the people who support him. These are the people who help his campaign and who will support him again in November and 2 years from now, when I believe he's going to run for another term, another presidential term. So he's trying to make more money for the U.S. business. This is not the good news for Russia, no matter what many commentators are saying. The more money there is in NATO, the more weapons they'll buy, the more militaristic towards Russia they'll become. On the other hand, we see Trump having a very friendly meeting with Vladimir Putin. So what Trump wants to do, essentially, the logic of his position is to break up the existing international system. What he wants to have is the return to nation state as the main unit of geopolitical power. What we have now in the world is essentially the rule of the financial capital, not based in any particular country. In fact, the bank executives and many other people connected to the flow of money don't really care which country they're in. They are not nationally based. What Trump wants to do is to return to the national base of geopolitical power. And in this respect, Vladimir Putin is his ally, because Vladimir Putin wants to do the same thing for Russia. He wants to clean up Russia from the financial oligarchs. And Trump is doing the same thing here in the United States. He's emphasizing some branches of business, like the industry and the manufacturing and the energy sector, at the expense of the bankers and the financial capital. So in this sense, Trump and Putin are on the same side. However, the more investment in the military you have, the more likely there is that there's going to be some accident down the line, maybe created by the other side, artificially engineered, that may lead to some kind of a bigger conflagration. So what I would like to see coming out of the meeting between Trump and Putin is actually the emphasis on the reduction of armaments, the reduction of the investment in the military. But we are not seeing that. What we are so in a certain respect, Trump's foreign policy is inconsistent. In other words, it may be consistent at this time, but down the line there's going to be conflict, because the more money you get into NATO, the bigger NATO will become, and the more of a threat to Russia it will be, and the more Russia will militarize. So in other words, yeah, his friendship with Putin, I think, is simply a temporary, it's a tactical move. And I'll tell you why. In fact, we have to look at the laws of geopolitics to understand what's going on. We have to look at the big picture. And the big picture is simple. Essentially, you have three big powers in the world: the US, Russia, and China. So you've got the US eagle, the Russian bear, and the Chinese dragon. The US, in my opinion, was able to win the Cold War because Nixon and Kissinger, whatever you may think of them, they were successful in separating the Soviet Union from China and making them into enemies and getting China on the side of the United States. So what you had after, the factors that you had that led to the victory of the US in the Cold War is the US and China being on the same side against the Soviet Union on the other side. What we are seeing right now with Trump is that he thinks that China is a bigger long-term enemy than Russia. And this is, I mean, if you follow the Aspen Security Forum, which is essentially the main annual meeting of the national security and intelligence people in the United States, and some of the invitees also come from Europe, you'll see that what they're saying is that, Russia may be an enemy now, but 5 to 10 years from now, it's going to be China. China has a long-term strategy for becoming a global power, which Russia does not have. China has an ideology, socialism with the Chinese characteristics, that China seeks to pass on to other countries. And Russia has no ideology whatsoever right now. I mean, the Soviet Union had an ideology, but today's Russia doesn't have an ideology. And this is the weakness of Russia. And I think Putin recognizes that. So what's happening right now, essentially, Trump wants to get Putin on his side in this long-term conflict with China. Whereas the opponents of Trump, they are closer to the Chinese. And what they want in a certain respect, but I think this strategy has failed, is to get China and the United States against Russia. But this strategy has failed. I mean, let me just give you one example here. Last year, 2017, let's look at the World Economic Forum in Davos. That's the main summit of the global financial elite. Who was the guest of honor last year, immediately after the election of Donald Trump? I'll tell you, it was the Chinese President Xi Jinping. And why? Because the globalists, the financial capital elite, thought that Xi Jinping would be their poster guy, their hero against Trump and Putin. That Xi Jinping was going to carry out this message of neoliberal globalization for the world. However, this strategy failed. And now they moved to Emmanuel Macron, which, we'll talk about him a little bit later. So he is their new chosen poster guy, the president of France, Emmanuel Macron. But he, of course, cannot be as powerful as the Chinese President Xi Jinping. So in other words, the opponents of Trump are confused right now. They don't know who they can rely on. They've got Macron, but Macron is not strong enough at this point of time. Whereas Trump is having a simple strategy. We need Putin on our side in order to confront the Chinese. That's the only way that the U.S. would be able to, in a certain sense, to modify the Chinese expansionism, is to have Russia on its side. In the 90s, the idea was even more diabolical. It was to get Russia to fight against China. And in fact, in my opinion, that was one of the reasons that Russia was not broken up in the 90s, because it was falling apart. Chechnya was getting separated, and many other republics in the Caucasus, like Dagestan and Kabardino-Balkaria, were getting restive. Tatarstan, too. In Siberia, you had Yakutia, issuing its own documents and so on and so forth. But somebody said in Washington, D.C., the deep state, no, we need Russia as a whole as a nuclear power so that we can use Russia as an instrument against China at some point of time in the future. Well, with the election of Putin, this strategy has failed, but now Trump is trying to revive it. So it's not that Trump likes Putin, it's that Trump needs Putin to achieve his long-term perspective, which is to get the U.S. To be more powerful than China. Because the way things are, the U.S. is losing out. The U.S. is losing out using the rules it set up itself with the IMF and World Bank in the 1940s. This system is, just look at the trade deficit, just look at the national debt. This system is clearly failing. So what Trump wants to do, I don't know whether he's going to be successful. Perhaps it's too late to make any fundamental changes at all. But what he wants to do is he wants to develop different rules of the game where the U.S. would become strong again economically, which is not the case now.
But one of the things I always do when people ask me, they say, oh, well, there was this very highly publicized summit or meetings, and they come up with all the bullet points covered during the meetings. I usually disregard those, Philip, because what I'm interested usually is what lies beneath, because usually what's publicized about these really massively hyped summits, Trump, Putin meetings, etc., is only for the public consumption entertainment, or sometimes on purpose they are diversion of what really is being discussed behind the closed doors, the points that nobody comes out and talks about. So usually I don't put any beef in what the media makes out of all these really shenanigans with the summits. But let's take some of these points you make, because there are so many great points. I don't even know which one to start with. But when you're referring to, for example, Trump's policy, Trump's attitude, Trump's stand, and then, of course, the neoliberals on the other side. And then we always hear, when we discuss these issues, rightfully so, we refer to the deep state. Now, with all the things that you just discussed, are you seeing Trump and his stand as a singular man with his own ideology, with his own opinions, with his own stand, taking on basically the deep state, which includes many of the liberals there, neoliberals? Or do you see this as something that is even more cynical, something that is concocted as a temporary detour? The reason I'm saying temporary detour, with Donald Trump, as ridiculous as so many things he says, we started this age of popularism, It's when people are going, and this is not only in the United States, we are seeing all over Europe, the rise in nationalism. People are just sick and tired of all the old liberal policies. As you said, IMF, World Bank, a big, bloated, irrelevant NATO. So in this age, people like Trump, they are popular. I mean, look what's happening in Hungary, okay? They shut down all Soros foundations. They kicked them out of the country. So do you believe with all the detours, everything that is happening, there is a bigger game in the plans? And what Trump is doing, the policy shifts we are seeing, are some kind of a temporary detour, and that is going to be set up so it would fail. It would bring about some really grave consequences, only to go back to neoliberalism and, in fact, pursue it even more radically. Just similar to false flag. Let's have a short 2 or 4 year period with rise of nationalism, people like Trump, and create a lot of chaos financially. Also, with all the wars we are seeing, so that, how the pendulum swings, so we can swing back and go back into neoliberalism and go this time even more radically. Is that a possibility?
Well, that's a very good question, Sibel. It's possible that this is the ultimate plan, is to get nationalism to rise up, which will lead to a war, a bigger war, a catastrophic war, and then to have some kind of a planetary union as the result of that. Because if you look at the history of world wars, if you look at what happened after World War I and World War II, you'll see the rise of global institutions, of global organizations. Let's say at the end of World War I, we had the League of Nations. It didn't work out. The U.S. was not a member. Without the U.S., the League fell apart. Well, after World War II, there was the United Nations. Well, I mean, it's there. It has some use, but it's essentially paralyzed because of the veto power. So does this mean that there has to be another big war for a kind of a stronger planetary government to be established? I mean, who knows? I have to say that what we need to develop, and this is the real challenge, is a new internationalism. In other words, nationalism is a failing strategy. I was born in Yugoslavia. It was a country that united the Serbs and Croats and the Slovenes and the Montenegrians, the Muslims and the Christians and the Jews. We all lived together in one country. And then the country was split, essentially by the outside forces supporting nationalist leaders within the country. So it wasn't the people that suddenly developed antagonistic feelings, willing to hurt and kill each other. It was the leaders who incited the people to do so. So I understand, based on my own experience, that nationalism is a wrong strategy. And this is why we have to be careful with all these ideas of making any country first, right? However, nationalism may be kind of the icebreaker against a neoliberal globalism, and then in this kind of struggle, new forces may emerge. So what I would advocate is for people to get the working people to get together, not the elites, because the elites are together anyway. What we are witnessing in the United States at this point of time is the clash of elites. I'm afraid that this clash may spill into the masses, and this would lead to horrible things happening. At this point of time, it is contained, but who knows? Each side may want to spread it out. Trump himself, he's an entertainer. He has made his name essentially in show business, and he says that he's a messenger. He's a messenger. That's what he says about himself. However, he's being supported by powerful economic interests. I talked about the industrial sector, the manufacturing sector, the energy sector. Now, we cannot take their concern for common people on face value, because it doesn't exist. But the people have to realize that it's going to take quite a long time to develop the strategies that we are talking about. So people have to be cautious not to fall for what's called a demagoguery, rather than some kind of a solid political ideology. What I'm afraid of the most is of countries turning extremely discriminatory against, let's say, foreigners or immigrants. Because this affects the quality of life, of daily life of everybody. And I'm afraid that the rhetoric that's sometimes used by Donald Trump may lead to this kind of may lead to this kind of outcome. This would be bad. This would be bad for the United States, and it would be bad for everybody living here. In Europe, this kind of ideology is not leading to positive results. You are talking about Hungary. Just 30 years ago, the Hungarian government built the fence to keep the Hungarians in, because it was essentially a dictatorship. Now they are building the fence to keep people out. Both strategies do not work. So what we may be facing with Sibel and Spiro, we may be facing with the lack of imagination. Essentially, the existing political ideology have exhausted themselves, but the new ones have not appeared. So these could be truly the dark ages. Essentially, there's just nothing good out there. However, I'm sure that the good will happen, because I think by nature people are not aggressive, people are not violent. It is the ideas engineered by small groups of people who want to dominate the majority that make people turn to each other. So my advice would be, get educated, right? Be critical. Follow the organizations like ours, like the Newsbud, right? Not fall for the mass media, or for the jingoism, or for the nationalism. But then again, if you look at past history, there have been many who have been saying the same things that we are saying right now, maybe 100 years ago and 200 years ago. Nobody listened to them. Very few listen to them, which is not to say that we shouldn't be saying them. We should be saying them, because we are representing, I think, the right side, even though it may not be the winning side at this point of time. But one day I'm sure it is going to win.
Well, if we were to take it in kind of a smaller chunks, let's talk about the EU, because when I was away, when I was reading various publications, talking with people, many tourists coming from different parts of the world to where I was, I heard a lot of people from countries like Greece, Spain, Italians. They are so disillusioned with EU. They believe they really, really got a really bad deal. And when you talk with them, and this is the more intellectual, educated crowd, they are looking back, looking at presence, and they are saying this was a failing proposition. And basically it was geared to benefit the two big countries. Basically, you're looking at Germany, you're looking at France, and the rest of us are suffering. I mean, look what's happening in Greece economically. Now, granted, a lot of it, people are saying it's due to their corrupt leadership, that they made financially unsound decisions. A lot of the money went into some politicians' pockets. There was some corruption. But that doesn't explain tens of, if not hundreds of billions of dollars mistake, because you're looking at grander plan by Germany, which basically right now owns Greece. The airports, the major transportation arteries, and you talk with Greeks, most of them, you hear a different story than let's say, when you talk with people in Germany. Same thing with Spain. Same thing with Italy. And now they are saying they're going to, Bulgaria is about to be approved to become a member of EU. But on the other hand, you're having these really highly unsatisfied countries, nations, and their populations saying this was the worst mistake. In fact, when I was in Turkey, there were Greeks who were saying, don't do what we did. Don't become part of the EU. Don't be so anxious to become part of the EU. What would be your response to that? And how do you view, or how do you see the near future, not far future, of EU? What's going to happen with the EU in general?
Well, the EU is falling apart. There is no question about that. The EU was set up to help the development of businesses. In other words, the idea behind the EU was not the benefit of the common people. It was the benefit of certain banks and certain corporations. So in other words, the EU within this kind of model was for the benefit of the European oligarchy and not for the benefit of the European working classes. So the people see that. However, the solution is not to go back to many nation states fighting against each other, being antagonistic to each other. The solution is to develop a different kind of union, a different kind of getting together, which would honor the interests of the people and not the interests of the oligarchs. Because the problem with the US, with the EU right now is that if it completely collapses, you may see the rise of antagonistic nationalisms leading to conflicts within Europe itself. I mean, if you look at the European history, you'll see one war after another. And in fact, within the last century, the 20th century, there were two huge wars taking place mostly in Europe and leading to millions of dead and hurt people. So the solution is to come up with a different kind of project. On this topic, I would recommend the book by Yanis Varoufakis called The Adults in the Room. He's a former Greek finance minister who wanted to develop a different kind of system, who wanted Greece to be respected and dignified within the EU, but also not to break the EU up, not to get Greece out of the EU. Because see, so we are faced again with the same dilemma here. Yeah, let's split. But what do we get? Okay, so the EU is going to fall apart. We have 27 countries which are now on their own. Who is this beneficial to? It is beneficial to the outside powers, the US and Russia. And in fact, it is also on this front that Trump and Putin could be on the same side, because the EU, a strong EU, would be a powerful competitor to both Russia and the United States. So in other words, this ideology of let's get rid of the EU is also beneficial to the outside powers. Now, when I was active in Montenegro as a political activist and commentator, I always was against this kind of the EU, and I wrote against it. I said this kind of the EU is like the former Soviet Union. We have the commissars, the commissar for this, the commissar for that, just like within the Soviet Union. So the model was essentially the same. It was the rule from the center. So what we need is some kind of a decentralized union based on European geographic position. In other words, there should be something about being in Europe and being connected to this geographic region that would naturally bring people together. So what I'm saying is, yes, the EU's fate is sealed, it's doomed. But I'm not sure that the outcome of this collapse is going to be positive unless we have a clear idea that people should unite rather than be separate, be divided, and be antagonistic to each other. What Orban is doing in Hungary and what the leaders are doing in Poland, what we are seeing in Italy, what we are seeing in some other European countries in terms of the anti-immigrant attitude is not good. It is not good. I understand why this is happening because I know people who live in Italy and I know people who live in Hungary. I understand why this is happening. But the solution is not to become more nationalistic. The solution, in my opinion, is to remain internationalistic, but in a different way, valuing the contribution of the common people, but being against the elites, the oligarchs, who got this mess going in the first place because they want to preserve their economic power. Just look at the gap between the rich and poor. It's growing every year. In the US, in Russia, in China, we are talking about these animosities, Russia versus China versus the United States. And yet the rich people in all these countries are getting richer and the poor are getting poorer. So isn't it time for the poor people to unite from all countries, no matter who they are, because they have a common economic interest? They are being exploited by their elites. So if the elites can get together formally or informally through many secret or semi-secret organizations, why is it that the masses and the poor people can't organize and get together and fight for a better world? This has to be done. Otherwise we'll fall into the trap of nationalism, which leads to hatred, to violence, and ultimately to war. And then you have a situation where you've got poor people on one side fighting as the poor people on the other side for the benefit of the elites that in the end will make up and everything will be fine except that millions are dead. So this is something to think about really and to consider seriously.
And I think it's that you made some really important points, and I know which side aspect of nationalism you are referring to, because as you said, the prejudice against the outside countries, but then usually people don't talk about the positive aspects of nationalism, okay? And that is each nation having its own, even it may be different within the regions inside one nation, valuing things like heritage and culture, okay? That is so important. One of the things that I hear people complaining, and something that this is why I don't want Turkey to become part of the EU, in addition to the reasons you cited, is this homogenization. Everything is, they try to dictate these rules, and there are thousands of pages. They handed it to Turkey, okay? And they said, you're going to eliminate these incredible national food, cultural food, because they do not meet EU guidelines. For example, something like steak tartare, okay, is some sort of a raw meat delicacy that is eaten commonly in certain region of Turkey. And to say we want to see homogenized Europe, so Italy, it has to give up a lot of traditional things that made Italians. Everybody's going to come out of it be homogenized and pasteurized, which is exactly the neoliberal idea for the whole world. Let us all be the same. Let us just give up all the great things that actually held us together. Because there is one thing of falling apart with your neighbor country, but people are falling from within. They are so divided and thus conquered. Thus the reason they don't get together and meet, because we want to implement, let's say here in the United States, we are not the EU, with all the federal government's rules. I mean, really, states had their own identities, Philip, and they like that identity. And sure, because of the security and commerce and all these reasons, there needs to be this cohesive ground rules that links them together. But to the point where they become all homogenized, thus neutralized, this is the aspect of nationalism that I don't think should have any negative connotation to it. I want to preserve some of those heritage of Turkey, whether it applies to certain food, whether it applies to certain practices that makes Turks Turk. Same thing for Italians. That's what makes Italian. Granted, those in Sicily, they don't have the same tradition than those in the north, in Turin region, or whether it is heritage in Greece. To see the disappearance of these differences and to hold on to it in the name of nationalism, I can't see that. I mean, I don't see it as a negative thing or an unreasonable expectation or demand. And why can't we keep those in place? Why there was this force to get these nations to a point that they are all pasteurized and homogenized?
the main reason behind it, Sibel, is to make money. To sell Coca-Cola in every country in the world.
Right.
So instead of drinking your traditional drink, you drink Coca-Cola and you go to McDonald's, right? So the idea was to make money, to sell one product globally.
Yeah.
I agree with you 100%. Heritage, traditional heritage and culture, that's what makes cultures different from each other and rich and unique. What I was talking about was the offensive nature of nationalism, the attacking, the aggressive nature that we have seen with many great powers, with many big countries, the expansion of territories to control the resources of other countries, saying you are inferior and we are superior. This is what I'm against. So, and I would call this chauvinistic nationalism. But we can have cultural nationalism, which I would call patriotism, right? You love the land in which you were born and you connect to the traditions and heritage of this land. However, you are not allowed to use your heritage and tradition saying to others, you've got to follow these rules that I follow because I think you are inferior and I'm superior. And this is exactly what we have seen with neoliberalism. We have seen this with the IMF and the World Bank and many other neoliberal institutions saying to all countries of the world, you have to follow the same program because at the end of the day, you have to live like we do. And unless you live the way we tell you to live, we'll destroy you. You'll disappear.
Many of us, many people, they try to assign a school of philosophy or a political philosophy to the current president here in the United States, Donald Trump. Now, we kept talking about Clintonites and the neoliberals. What is your characterization of Donald Trump? I mean, does he fit within the mold of neoconservative or conservative? Are we looking at someone who is similar in some ways to Ronald Reagan? Because he came from that entertainment background too. You know, he was the B actor, he was a Republican, he was the more nationalistic conservative. What would you consider Donald Trump, Philip?
Well, Trump is idiosyncratic. He is a businessman. He comes from the outside of the system. And what he wants to do, if he is to be believed, of course, is he wants to introduce the laws of business and common sense into politics. And if you look at his economic policies, they're all about the U.S. businesses making money at the expense of the businesses of other countries. So I would say that he is an economic nationalist, and so what he wants to do, he wants to bring back jobs to the United States. But then, is this really possible? I mean, hasn't technology and the global structures developed in such a way that it is impossible to turn the clock back? Who knows? The time will tell. Some Russians compare Trump to Mikhail Gorbachev, and that's not a compliment because Mikhail Gorbachev and his policies of trying to reform the Soviet Union led to the collapse of the Soviet Union, to break up of the Soviet Union, to the loss of the Cold War. So, I mean, one thing is clear, that the U.S. was losing the global game under the existing rules. So something had to be done to change the global rules because the Chinese have accepted the US rules and then began winning against the United States using the rules set up by the United States. So some smart people in the United States said, well, we need to change the rules in order to keep winning. And this is exactly what they're doing. And they need, I mean, the Trump people need Putin because they must not allow Russia and China to be together. Having Russia and China on the same side against the United States is the equivalent what Hitler did in 1941 when he attacked the Soviet Union. And instead of fighting only against the British and the British at the time, he began fighting on two fronts, and he lost. He destroyed Germany. His policies of fighting on two fronts led to the complete destruction of Germany and the occupation of Germany, which lasts to this day. Because let's remember that there are tens of thousands of the US troops in Germany. So Germany is not independent. It may be independent in terms of its economic policy, but in terms of its geopolitical position and its military policy, it is an occupied country. So in other words, people who attack Trump due to his alleged friendship with Putin, I mean, they don't know what they're talking about. They are idiots in terms of geopolitics because the U.S. needs Russia if it wants to confront China and win in this confrontation. I'm not talking about a war between the U.S. and China. I'm talking about the economic competition where no more U.S. businesses, everything is owned by the Chinese businesses, right? So it is the money that's being made in the United States is going to China, and the Chinese oligarchy, remember, not going to the Chinese people, because China is not a democracy. Let's not forget that. It's a country ruled by the Communist Party. It's one party political system. But for some reason, in the U.S., many commentators are focusing on Russia and talking about how Vladimir Putin is dictatorial. But there are 50 political parties in Russia. There are newspapers in Russia that cover every single political viewpoint, from the neoliberal to the neo-fascist. And I know that because I read them every day and I cover newspapers, Russian newspapers for NewsBud. Whereas in China, you know how many there are? Just the regular ruling party newspaper. So let's not forget. So Russia could be an ally of the United States, should be an ally of the United States. But the way Russia is being presented in the United States it goes against this necessity. What we are seeing, if you look at the public opinion polls, is that more than half of the U.S. of the Americans believe that Russia is an enemy. I think that's horrible. I mean, Russia has its own national interest, its own geopolitical vision, but this geopolitical vision is not globally confrontational compared to the Chinese vision. If you look at, the Chinese geopolitical strategy in the long term, what they want to do is essentially replace the United States, get other countries to support the Chinese side as opposed to the U.S. side. In the Russian case, this is much more ambivalent. And Trump knows that, and I think what he's doing by meeting with Putin and talking to Putin, it's very sophisticated. However, who knows if Putin is going to accept this? I mean, Putin is going to ask for the U.S. to compromise on the question of Ukraine, the question of Syria, the question of Central Asia. This is an issue we need to discuss at some point, the question of Central Asia, because if you look at the Central Asian republics, the potential, for bloody conflict is even bigger than in the Middle East. Think about the Middle East and the decades of bloodshed, and multiply this by 10 or by 100 when we are talking about Central Asia, countries like Tajikistan and Turkmenistan and Uzbekistan and perhaps
That's
also
interesting, Philip. I have been saying this, predicting this consistently for the past 8 years. I kept telling people that this is short-lived, short-term, what we are seeing in terms of the turmoil in the Middle East. The real conflicts, the real battles will be fought over Central Asia and Caucasus, We know that the world's most resources are still there. That's where they are sitting on those reserves, and that's where we're gonna see the major conflicts. Of course, a lot of people shrug it off as saying, I can't even pronounce the names of these countries. I don't even know where they are. But I can think in terms of Saudi Arabia. But that brings me to my final questions. I'm sure Spiro may have you may have more questions, but assuming that you're right. It was the populism prevailing with Donald Trump, and let's accept him as an outsider who came in. What is the prospect? What even are the chances of this approach of getting closer to Russia, and that is to counter China? What are the prospects or the chances of this prevailing when you have the neoliberals, when you have the entire mainstream media, when you have the entire Hollywood and the publishing houses here, and the majority in the EU in terms of the governing class, the oligarch, they stand against what Trump is standing. So what are his chances? I mean, you even said he's going to run again and he's going to get reelected. And I don't think I've ever seen it in the history of this country. An outsider getting elected and attempting to turn things upside down, turn it on its head, and even living afterward. I mean, John F. Kennedy tried, not in the conservative, not in the same populism that we are talking about, and we know what happened to him. Even with Nixon, we saw how he was set up and he was eliminated. So with that in mind, that is my final question. That's my question to you. What are the chances? Do you see this prevailing, considering the size of Trump's opponents, enemy out there? And if so, how?
Well, this is very difficult to say. I don't have a crystal ball to predict. I do believe that there are dangers to Donald Trump, and that he should be aware of. We'll see what happens in November 1st. The elections in November are very important. And if Trump is able, if the Republicans are able to retain the control of the U.S. Congress, then Trump will be able to, run again. I don't know whether he will win or not. I just said that he's going to decide to run again. I don't know about the outcome of the election. I'm looking at the book publishing industry. I follow very closely the titles published every month by the U.S. publishers regarding the U.S. Politics, domestic politics. And what I'm seeing is that there are many titles attacking Trump, but there are also many titles, many writers supporting Trump. And this was not the case with Nixon. I looked into history, and during the days of Nixon, there were many people attacking Nixon in the book publishing industry, but there were very few defending him. Now what we see is that this effort is essentially balanced out. For instance, there is a book that came out this month about Trump being Putin's informer, Putin's spy, Trump being a traitor. But at the same time, there is a book that came out that says that the Russian thing is a hoax. That it's all made up by the Clintonites in order to destroy Trump's reputation and make it impossible for him to put in place the economic policies that would go against the financial elite and in favor of the other elite, of the energy sector or the military industrial complex. So we don't know. I don't know what's going to happen. What I'm afraid of is that the political conflict will spill out, that somebody will try to expand the conflict, that get the people involved. And this is not what I would like to see, because I consider the United States my second homeland, and I would never want to see some kind of a polarizing violence in the United States happen. But I'm afraid that there are people in Washington, D.C. who may not have, because I have the experience of the Civil War, and I've gone through that. It's a horrible, horrible thing. But there seem to be people in Washington, D.C. who want to rag the country up, to break it up, to pushing for different states to secede, and here in California, organizing covertly different campaigns to get California out of the union and all of that. I mean, this is an effort to it's going to lead to chaos. So I hope that for our sake, all of us, that the political class is able to find some kind of compromise. Otherwise, and the people too. But unfortunately, the people are always led by their leaders. In other words, they are not independent, unfortunately. I'm very sorry to say that, but they seem to be easily manipulated by the leaders, by the ruling class. So we have to look at the ruling class. I think the ruling class is very decadent, but please do not destroy the branch that you are sitting on, because it's gonna be horrible for everybody. And so it's difficult to say what's going to happen to Donald Trump. I think he is definitely under pressure, but I also think that he has strong protectors. I'm not his supporter. I'm trying to be objective here. He wants to do something different, and the way John F. Kennedy wanted to do something different. He also wanted to essentially to make peace with the Russians at the time, to develop this ideology of coexistence. Then he was almost pushed into a nuclear war, essentially by the CIA and the deep state over Cuba. And then when he was able successfully, and in fact, very advantageously for the United States to win the conflict, this was not expected. I mean, he won. The Cuban Missile Crisis is a geopolitical victory of the United States. Then he was assassinated. I guess that was the only way they could stop him from further victories. So a lesson learned. I hope that whoever is in charge of Donald Trump's security learned the lesson from the past and does a much better job. Let me just make one point here about the CIA. Gina Haspel, the new director of the CIA, we'll see. Trump wanted her, even though she's got a horrible dossier, things she did in the past. But he wanted her. You know why, Sibel? You know well why he wanted her. Because he can keep her in his hand. Because if he doesn't do what he wants her to do, he's going to give all the dossier into the media and she's going to be gone very soon. So this is why she's been chosen, because she's got a lot of skeletons in her closet. We'll see if this was a good choice. Whether Gina Haspel is gonna follow Donald Trump or will be influenced by John Brennan and other former CIA leaders who are now in the opposition to Trump. I mean, what John Brennan is doing, the things that he said, I can't believe that the high government official, in fact, the former director of the CIA, could say things like this publicly about his president. I mean, this to me is mind-boggling.
Yes. Yeah, well, absolutely. Recently, Philip, you mentioned Brennan, the former CIA director, who now works for NBC or MSNBC News, by the way, came out calling Trump a traitor, and a lot of this stuff was geared towards his, of course, based off of the Russia narrative, the Russiagate narrative, which was, of course, spearheaded by these same people within these intelligence agencies. From what, according to people like Seymour Hersh and others, I mean, they've said that the whole thing was a Brennan op, and that this whole Russiagate hoax was meant, like you said, to derail Trump. And there's very powerful interests, anti-Russian interests, who have built empires upon the anti-Russia narrative. To the Cold War, all these wars, all of the armaments and military buildups. At the end, so he's going up against some powerful, potentially dangerous enemies, obviously, if he is going to make a peace with Russia. There's a lot of interests that don't want a peace with Russia, whether it's real or not or whatever. They need that boogeyman to continue their external threat, So as far as Trump, Sibel, you brought up some really great points that I find extremely interesting, of whether Trump is legit or not, whether, he is who he says he is. For me personally, I don't know if it's because I'm so cynical. I don't trust any of them. I have a hard time letting myself trust, or I'm definitely not on any bandwagons. I'm not a supporter left or right. But and then Philip had mentioned, he's an outsider from the establishment and everything, and that may be true to a lot of degrees, but at the same time, in my opinion, you don't get to that level, whether it's the wealthy businessman, one of the richest men in the world, rich and powerful men in the world, without playing ball with the system, without playing ball with that establishment. And you certainly, get to that level and become actually president, so without playing ball and with that system. Now, no doubt he's a smart guy. Whether he's legit or not is we'll have to see. But we have seen his cabinet be surrounded himself with establishment insiders. For the most part, from what we've seen, and we have seen, and I've seen it myself. He's being advised with not really the best advice from some of these people, and they have their own agendas. And so, sure, he's going to be manipulated on some of this stuff. But great discussion. You guys bring up some excellent points, and we're going to continue this discussion in future sessions here. Briefly, I'd like to get any last points that you guys would like to contribute before we wrap up this session here.
Philip?
None. I'll just keep following the developments, and looking forward to connecting with NewsBud community through my show, the Russian Newspapers Monitor. There's going to be an edition coming up this Sunday. Thank you for your feedback, and very soon we'll be back, right, Sibel?
Absolutely. I was going to say my last comment is we need to schedule and record our next segment, because this was just scratching the surface. It was the tip of the iceberg. I really would like to get your take, Professor Kovacevic, on Iran. I have many more questions on Russia. And I think as soon as we hang up before this evening, we are going to email each other and coordinate and set up the time and date for our next recording. And that's my last comment.
Well, I'd like to thank Professor Phil Kovacevic and Sibel Edmonds for this incredible discussion. I enjoyed it. I'm sure our community members joined it as well. And of course, we would like to thank our supporters at NewsBud. Without you, none of this is possible. So stay tuned. We're going to be coming up